We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Make sure you subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where you get videos weekly. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. David Jacks is our guest to talk about his book, Peter Asher, A Life in Music. This book covers the life and career of English guitarist, singer, manager, and record producer Peter Asher, who was one half of the 60s pop duo Peter and Gordon before going on to a successful career as a manager and a legendary career as record producer. He's worked with a long list of artists including James Taylor, Linda Ronstadt, Bonnie Raitt, Steely Dan's Donald Fagan, Diana Ross, Cher, Neil Diamond, Randy Newman, Kenny Loggins, Morrissey, Ed Sheeran, and Steve Martin. David Jacks spoke with Peter himself for the book, along with over 100 artists, friends, and colleagues. To hear a playlist of Peter Asher's work, head over to the show notes page. But first, here is David Jacks. David, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You introduced the book by noting Peter being appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2015 for his services to the British music industry. You write, quote, "If anyone deserves such an honor for their contributions to music and culture, it would be Peter Asher." A career spanning over 60 years. Can you talk about your chance encounter with Peter and how you were the lucky guy to help tell his story?
Yes, I worked for many years in Los Angeles in the entertainment industry. I was video editor and a music supervisor and various things like that. And I was in between jobs, and I was trying to think of what else maybe I could do to make some money. And I thought, well, since I know about music to a certain extent, I'll write some articles. Maybe I can get something published. So that was kind of in my head when I happened to bump into Peter at we were standing in line together to order some tacos at some fast food joint in Santa Monica. And I thought it was Peter. You know, he had his back to me and I'd never met him. But with his voice and what he was talking about to this person next to him, when he finished their conversation, I said, "Well, are you Peter Asher?" He said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Well, I'd like to interview you." And he said, "Well, here's my assistant. She'll set it up." And it was that easy. So we did an interview and it went really well. Peter seemed impressed at the end of it. He said, "Oh, you know your stuff." I thought, yeah, I know my stuff. So I, transcribed it and thought, well, this will be a little Q&A. But the more I thought about it, I thought, I can't believe nobody has written a book about this guy. And so I asked him for a second interview. And when I went back with some more questions, at the end, I said, "Well, are you going to write an autobiography?" And he said, "No." He said, "I have no interest in doing that. People have asked me, and I'm not going to do that." And I said, "Well, I'd like to, take a crack at writing a biography." And he looked at me like I was nuts. He said, "Well, who's going to want to read it? It's just me." And I said, "Well, I think some people would be interested in a career, reading about a career like this." So he didn't, say no. He didn't talk me out of it. So I kept going back, year after year with more questions. And I'd talk with a group of people and I'd amass, questions from what they told me. I'd go back to Peter. "Well, they said this. Is that what you remember?" So he was always very gracious with his time. And at one point he said, "I admire your persistence." And I just kept going until finally, we have this. My first book, I think it turned out okay.
When did you become a fan of his?
Oh, well, I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show when I was 8, and I was already interested in music. My father was an amateur musician, and so we had kind of music when I'd be driving with him. We'd always have the radio on, and we'd sing together. So I saw the Beatles, and of course that lit a big fire. And of course, soon after the Beatles hit, within a couple of months, there was Peter and Gordon, and I was buying their records. And then I, later on started seeing his name listed as producer on James Taylor and Linda Ronstadt, things like that. As I was growing up, I'd see, like George Martin's name on a Beatle record as producer. Well, what does a producer do? What does that mean? And I was interested in figuring those things out. How are records made? How do you do this? So that was one of the things I was hoping to do with the book, was talk about Peter as a producer and what he does in the studio, how he approaches things, talk about the difference between when Peter and Gordon recorded in the 60s in London. They had like 3 hours. They had to go in 3 hours and basically finish 3 records. Whereas when he was a producer in the 70s, he kind of brought a whole new way of producing to things, where he would, get good musicians together and give them the time to come up with an arrangement with the groove. Sometimes, you may have gotten something done in 3 hours, maybe not. You come back the next day, you try it again. Part of what I wanted to do was talk not only about Peter's career, but how records are made.
And before we get to his career in music and as a producer, when and where is he born? What was his life like growing up?
In London. He was the first child of his parents. They had 2 daughters after him, but he was the first out. And most people don't know that he started work in the entertainment industry when he was like 6 or 7. He was a child actor. He got a movie role right off the bat. He played Claudette Colbert's son in a movie in England. It was released over here, but didn't do very well. And he played Claudette Colbert's son. And he did other movies, a lot of radio work, television. He was on stage in England. So he had a pretty significant career for a while until he started at Westminster School, which was a very kind of private institution there in London, in the shadow of Westminster Abbey. That school had been around since Elizabeth I. And once you start going to a school like that, you can't really take an awful lot of time for acting and things like that. So he kind of let his career go, while of course, his sister Jane, she had a great career as an actress.
Can you talk about how his future Gordon and Peter partner Gordon Waller plays a role in Peter's desire to turn music from a hobby into a career?
Yeah, I mean, his mother, Peter's mother, was a music professor at the Royal Academy of Music, and she also was a tutor for students at other schools. She tutored George Martin. When he was going to music school, he needed some oboe lessons. So he was taught by Margaret Asher, and he talked about coming over to the house where Margaret had a little music studio, and he would run into the Asher children running around. So Peter was already had music kind of in his DNA through his mom, and she taught him gave him some oboe lessons as well. He started singing in competitions as a kid, as a boy soprano, and sang in choirs. And then, of course, once skiffle music started up, he got a guitar and started playing in a skiffle band with some friends, an amateur kind of thing. And I think he didn't necessarily know that music was going to be his career until he ran into Gordon at Westminster. He was another student at the school. And they just ran into each other at one point and started, "Oh, you play guitar too? Oh, you sing too?" And they started kind of jamming together and realized that their voices really went well together. Gordon had this nice, rich baritone, and of course, Peter had this nice tenor. And Gordon said he told me that Peter was the best harmony singer he'd ever sang with. So they started kind of just going and playing at parties, and maybe playing at a pub someplace for free beer and a sandwich, and just kind of working on their act. Eventually, they found someone who got them a nice gig at a place called the Pickwick Club, and it was there they ran into an A&R guy from EMI who said, "Oh, why don't you come for an audition? And he was thinking of them as being kind of Britain's answer to like the Kingston Trio or Peter, Paul, and Mary back when the folk boom was happening in the United States. But of course, because of Jane's boyfriend at the time was a very good songwriter, Paul McCartney, they were able to get this song, which the Beatles had decided they weren't going to do, and had a #1 record right off the bat with A World Without Love, and kind of started going down the pop end of things as opposed to the folk. Although there's some great folk songs on those records that Peter and Gordon did. They did a lot of interesting material, everything from folk to jazz or on those albums. So they had some wide-ranging musical interests there. So yeah, they had, hit after hit after hit in the 60s. And so that's kind of how Peter and Gordon happened.
There are some great stories in the book that Peter tells you regarding some of the early Beatles classics being written right there in Peter's home, in the basement music room. One of them was I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Yeah, Margaret had this basement music room where she gave lessons, where she was tutoring school students. And once Paul McCartney moved into the house, the Beatles all moved to London in like the spring of 1963 because their career was really starting to take off. They needed to be close to where it was all happening, and they were sharing an apartment somewhere. But because he was hanging out at the Asher's household so much, there was a spare room upstairs next to Peter's room, and Margaret just said, "Well, why don't you just move in up there?" So sometimes when it was time for Paul to write a song with John Lennon, they would go down to the basement music room and work on songs there. So at one point, and Peter tells this story a lot, where John Lennon comes over, Paul goes downstairs with him. They're working on a song for about an hour or so. And then Paul calls upstairs to Peter and says, "Why don't you come down and listen to what we just wrote? See what you think?" And so he comes down. The little cramped room, there's just really room enough for an upright piano and a chair and some bookcases. That's like about it. So he sits in the chair and he says Paul and John sat next to each other at the piano and sing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" for the first time to anybody.
Wow.
And says, "Okay, what do you think?" Peter says, yeah. And of course, Peter said, the main thing he said to them, which any songwriter wants to hear, is "Play it again."
Yeah.
He wanted immediately, "Oh, that was great, play it again." So that happened, I think, on numerous occasions at the Asher household. Of course, Paul tells a story a lot where he wrote "Yesterday" up in his room at one point. When he woke up out of a dream, he kind of dreamed it. But yeah, Paul worked on a lot of songs there at the Asher household. And I think that piano that I mentioned is now at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Peter donated it to them.
You mentioned A World Without Love, which hit #1 both in the UK and the US. Can you share this story? This is in the book. Also in the book is a picture of a piece of notebook paper with some of the lyrics to what would become that song, A World Without Love. This was an unfinished song that Paul got stuck on, right?
Yeah, Peter was nice enough to let me use that piece of paper as an illustration. But because they got this, they did the audition at EMI, Peter and Gordon, and signed a contract, which Peter, of course, says was a terrible contract. So they didn't make a lot of money on those records. They, like A World Without Love, they probably made $5,000 from that. Even though it was a worldwide hit, that they weren't being paid a lot, and neither were the Beatles really. But so they had their audition, they got the contract, and their producer at the time, Norman Newell, said, "Well, okay, if you guys come up with any original material that you think we should do, let me know." Because he was, again, still thinking of them in terms of like a folk act, and was thinking of using the old folk song 500 Miles as maybe the first single. But Peter, of course, sometimes would play a song Paul would sometimes play a song for Peter. that he was working on. And at one point, Peter heard A World Without Love, which at that point was just basically a verse. There was no bridge to it. It was unfinished. Paul had, brought it up to John's attention numerous times, and John hated it. And he thought the first line was stupid. So Paul just decided, well, that's never going anywhere. But Peter liked it and said, well, can we record this? And Paul said, sure. But it got up to like a week or two just before the first recording session, and it still wasn't finished. So they said, please, we need this. Please finish this song. So Gordon told me that Paul said, all right. And he walked up to his room, and just a few minutes later came down and said, okay, what do you think of this? And played them the bridge, which was, so I wait and in a while, that part. And they said, great, that's it. So they went into the recording studio just a couple of weeks later, and that was what they recorded, and that was the hit.
And a number one hit is born. When I started to listen to the music on Spotify and I was looking at the pictures of the album covers, I thought, this guy looks a lot like Austin Powers. And it's actually more like Austin Powers looks like Peter Asher. Is it true that Mike Myers patterned his look after Peter?
That's true. It says in the book that Peter told me that Mike Myers confessed to him that it was those promotional shots of Peter from the 60s that he based that look on, with the glasses and the bad teeth. And there's even some pictures of, there was a CD that came out called, I think, the Best of Peter and Gordon or something like that in the early 2000s. And Peter's on the cover wearing this very flowery kind of shirt. I mean, it's exactly
yes.
The jacket and the shirt and the glasses and the hair, and it looks just like Austin Powers. And that is what he based the look on. Although Peter, told me when we were talking about it, he said, well, of course, I could never compete with Austin Powers on the Shagadelic scale. But yes, the look was based on Peter.
So Peter and Gordon split up around 1967. They did record another album to fulfill their contract with EMI. Gordon wanted to be a solo artist, but Peter told you he had no interest in going solo. Actually ran his own bookstore for a short time, but that wasn't ultimately for him. It's while he's in charge of the A&R department at the Beatles' Apple Records label where he signs a then-unknown James Taylor and agrees to produce his 1968 debut solo album. Can you talk about how Peter enters his life, or actually it's more the other way around? James went to Peter's house unannounced and knocked on the door?
Knocked on the door. So just to back up a couple of years, Peter and Gordon, of course, toured the United States various times, and they weren't a band. It was just the two of them. So every time they toured, they had to find a backing band for them to accompany them. And at one point, there was a group from New York called the King Bees, and the King Bees did a short tour with Peter and Gordon. And one of the guys in the King Bees was a gentleman named Danny Korchmar, a guitar player and songwriter, producer. So at one point, the King Bees broke up, and Danny started another band with his childhood friend, James Taylor, called the Flying Machine. And then eventually the Flying Machine broke up, and James Taylor told me that he was just decided that he would go to Europe and just busk around, take his guitar, get by however he could, play in the street, whatever. And Danny, his old friend, gave him Peter's contact info and said, you might want to contact this guy. He can probably help you. So James came to London. He spent a few weeks with some friends. He recorded a demo of his songs that he had at the time, and then remembered, Danny giving him Peter's info. And so he came to his house with his demo and said, I'm Danny's friend. And I brought you this tape to listen to. And Peter put it on his reel-to-reel. And I spoke with Peter's then wife, Betsy. And Betsy told me that before the first song was over, they just looked at each other with their mouths open. They couldn't believe how good this guy was. And Peter said, well, I just got signed to be head of A&R for this new record label. I'd like to sign you. So that's how James Taylor got his first record deal. He was the first person that Apple Records signed. And they made an album. It didn't do that well. And then when Apple started to kind of fall apart within a year, and Alan Klein came in, the whole atmosphere kind of changed, and Peter decided, well, he didn't really feel like having Alan Klein for a boss, and he just took James Taylor, came to the United States, and within about a year signed a new deal with Warner Brothers, and they made Sweet Baby Jane's, which of course was a huge hit.
What was it about Apple they were unhappy with, and how were they able to eventually free James from Apple and make the move to Warner Brothers?
Well, it's one thing when your friends, the Beatles, are running things, but the Beatles started, there was a lot of business bickering going on, and it was a little chaotic, to say the least. Alan Klein was hired to come in and kind of take over. And actually, Betsy, Peter's first wife, had worked for Alan Klein in New York for his company, and had told Peter some stories. Peter didn't think he could be trusted, really, business-wise. And the atmosphere kind of changed. He started, he got rid of Zapple Records. He shuttered that. He started firing a lot of people. And I think Peter just thought, this is, the whole atmosphere has changed. This isn't my scene anymore, and decided to pick up and try to go elsewhere and see what he could do. He got hired actually first to be head of A&R for MGM Records right off the bat. But then that also, the whole business changed at MGM, and everyone got fired before he could really do much of anything. And then they moved to Los Angeles and signed the deal to make Sweet Baby James. But yeah, he just thought that, and also James Taylor had a meeting with Alan Klein, and Peter told me that meeting didn't go very well either. And as far as getting out of the contract, they just kind of left. And when Peter made the deal with Warner Brothers for Sweet Baby James, he told them, he said, we don't have a torn up contract or permission to leave or anything. So he had Warner Brothers, and it's in the book, write the deal so that it would indemnify Peter and James if Alan and Apple decided to sue them, that they wouldn't be on the hook for it. A gentleman named Nat Weiss, who was a business associate of Brian Epstein, and had been kind of a confidant to the Beatles, actually partnered up with Peter when he came over and started up his management company, and helped him a lot. But Nat Weiss actually told me that he spoke to George Harrison and tried to, convince him that, just let James go. And he said, I'll never forget it. He said, George said, well, I don't want to be a twat, meaning that, there were two ways to look at it. I don't want to stand in the way of another artist, but at the same time, I don't want to be, a jerk business wise and let a good artist go. So, he kind of had to, eventually, I think they also spoke with Paul McCartney, and then McCartney eventually, went to Klein and said, let's just let the guy go. Don't worry about it.
For that second album, both Peter and James have by now made the move to Los Angeles, and they're with Warner Brothers. Sweet Baby James is the name of the album, recorded in December of 1969, released in early 70. The title track, Fire and Rain, Country Road, and Sunny Skies are the singles. The songs were worked out in Peter's living room and then recorded at Sunset Sound Studios with a band of stellar musicians, including Danny Korchmar on guitar, Randy Meisner of the Eagles on bass, Carole King on piano and backing vocals, Russ Kunkel on drums, and Lee Sklar on bass.
Actually, Lee's not on the album. They did end up recording Country Roads again for the single release. And on the single release, Lee Sklar is playing.
He's on that one. Okay. Talk about Peter's contributions and a method he would use for the next decade and beyond. Korchmar told you about Peter's approach and something called the ensemble.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier when Peter was starting his career as a producer, really, especially with that album. He would hire, perceptive musicians. They would rehearse. Like you said, they rehearsed in Peter's living room. They would rehearse, they'd get the songs down, and then Peter would pretty much cut them live. But yeah, hiring, perceptive musicians, going through the songs, and Peter, I think James Taylor told me that a producer is something like a director in movies. So you're hiring the cast, you're bringing in the right people to play the music, and but that's something that Peter is really good at, is finding really good musicians that really would fit, would work on James's song, come up with a really good part that wouldn't get in the way of James or whoever it is that we're talking about that Peter's producing. Come up with a good part, not get in the way, do what they need to do, run through it a few times, figure out, who's going to sing the high part, who's going to sing the low part, kind of do a head arrangement. On all those James Taylor records that Peter produced, nothing was written down. So those musicians, had to be good enough to, James would run through the song, they'd figure out a good bass part or whatever. Kunkel was a great drummer, very much in the Ringo Starr mode, where he's musical. You're telling a story musically. So, when to emphasize this, when to lay back, when to be quiet. Being quiet is just as important as, playing something.
Sure.
Don't fill a hole where there's a hole just to fill the hole, and all that sort of thing. So Peter would give them, like I said, the room to find the groove, and then they would cut it live. And that's pretty much the way he worked for all those Linda Ronstadt records. Things like That'll Be the Day, which was a big hit for Linda, the Buddy Holly song. And that was live. She was singing live. They were playing live. Even the background vocals, they're live. And you got to have good people to do that.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. David Jacks is our guest to talk about his book, Peter Asher, A Life in Music, which is out now. I want to go back to that first album under Apple because there is a familiar song title, but the song itself is different from the one that most know, Carolina in My Mind. The version included on James Taylor's Best Of from 1976 is very different. The story behind that new recording is in your book. Warner Brothers asked Peter if James would re-record that song and Something in the Way She Moves from the Apple Records album, but that didn't happen. Can you explain why that was?
Yes. Well, if you recall, in the late 70s, early 80s, for a while, Apple was in, there were a lot of lawsuits going on between the Beatles, between Apple and Capitol. It was like, just lawyer heaven for a while. And so those tapes, those sessions were kind of in this limbo where you couldn't just license them, which, would have been the easy thing to do. And so because they weren't available and Warner Brothers wanted those two songs on that Greatest Hits album, they needed to re-record them. And Peter was always, and even James Taylor told me that though that first album was a little overproduced, Peter was so enamored of James and the talent and the songs that he wanted to make them stand out from the folk world. So there's some string quartet on it. They're fuller production. Even Carolina in My Mind, the first time I heard it on the radio, it's a great production. But by the time James Taylor became a hit with Fire and Rain and those Warner Brothers records, he was doing things much more low key and acoustic. And so since they had been doing Carolina in My Mind in that way for a few years now live, it was like, well, let's just do it in that way, not try to recreate that original version. So it's much more, like I said, acoustic-y and a little slower. So that's the way those two songs were done for the Greatest Hits. But I still, to tell you the truth, I prefer the Apple.
Do you really? Wow, interesting.
It's a great record.
Yeah.
Great record. And of course, Paul McCartney plays a great bass line on it. to you've got this great bass player on it. Nothing against Lee Sklar. He's a great bass player too. But I don't know. I just prefer the poppier, faster version, but that's just me.
Peter also managed Linda Ronstadt, produced several of her albums, starting with 1973's Don't Cry Now, her first to go gold, reached number 45. The next is 1974's Heart Like a Wheel. This is the big one, a number 1 album, 2 times platinum, a number 1 single, You're No Good, a number 2 single, When Will I Be Loved. Peter had a chance to work with Linda earlier, but that did not happen. The second opportunity he had to work with her, he jumped on it this time. Linda wanted him to manage her earlier, but he didn't. Why was that?
Well, I mean, this was at the beginning of his forming Peter Asher Management once they came to Los Angeles. And he had James Taylor, of course, and then he had also taken up James's sister, Kate Taylor. He started managing her, and he produced an album for her. And I think even though at first, when Linda Ronstadt asked him to produce her, he said yes. But then when he thought about it, it was like, well, I'm going to have my hands full with James. And also, James was ascending very quickly. And he was also trying to get Kate Taylor's career going. And then I think he thought taking up Linda Ronstadt at that time, that somebody was going to get shortchanged. And, he's a very fair-minded guy. And at that time, I mean, it was just him. He didn't have like a lot of assistants and stuff that maybe could take over for this person or that person. So he just said, well, I think I'd better just stick with these 2 clients right now. And so he didn't take up Linda Ronstadt as a client, as a manager. But then a couple of years later, he did say yes, because Kate Taylor was going to kind of retire for a while. She had decided that, the music career was taking her away from home, basically. She just wanted to spend more time at home. And so because she was going to kind of back off, she told Linda, well, why don't you ask Peter again? Because I'm not going to be doing this for much longer. So Peter said, yeah. So he signed her up to represent her. Well, I say signed her up. They never signed a contract. I mean, I was amazed. I mean, Peter and Linda, what they achieved over the next, 15 years or so, a massive success, both him managing her and producing these great records. But she never signed a contract with him.
Wow.
It was like a handshake. So it's just like, well, if we want to work together, we'll keep working together. And when we decide not to, then that'll dissolve the partnership. But yeah, I mean, these days, somebody like Linda Ronstadt and a top manager like Peter Asher, there'd be a 100-page document that you'd have to go through with lawyers involved. And,
yeah.
It's just amazing that they could just kind of just agree, like, okay, let's do this and have this great, successful string of records and a great career. I just found that amazing.
And they had a great relationship. Peter told you that he did something with Linda that not everyone did back then, especially to women. He actually listened to her ideas.
Yeah, exactly. She found this song, Heart Like a Wheel, and wanted to do it. And she would play it. She told me she would play it for various people that were, either producers or, A&R people or whatever. And they just go, what, are you crazy? That's not a hit. And she'd go, well, it doesn't matter. It's not a hit. It's a great song, but they didn't want her to record it. But she played it for Peter, of course. By the time they got around to putting songs together for Heart Like a Wheel, and he loved it. And he was like, yeah, we got to do that. So she said, that was the difference between Peter and a lot of other people in the recording industry there, is that he had a much, finer sense of great songs. You're not just looking for a hit. You're just looking for great songs. I mean, even with Sweet Baby James, he said, we had no idea what was going to be a hit on that album. We didn't record the album to have hits on it. We just wanted to make a great album. And then we had to figure out, well, what do we put out as a single? And I think, Peter certainly knows when he hears a song that it's going to be a hit, but he also understands that, a great song's a great song. You don't have to record it just because you want a hit. You record her because it's a great song. And Linda, of course, has, she knows what she should sing. I mean, I think Danny Korchmar told me that, the great thing about Linda is not just that you have a great voice, but you know what you should use that voice on, what you should be singing. And so they approach music that way. And I think that's the right way to do it.
And speaking of that song, Heart Like a Wheel, there's a picture in the book of Peter recording the song at the Sound Factory in Los Angeles, by the way, and a great story behind how Linda was introduced to this song by singer-songwriter Jerry Jeff Walker.
They were out partying in New York one time, and it was, they had spent all night at someone's house singing songs and this and that. And so then she and Jerry Jeff Walker jump in a cab, and the sun's coming up at this point. And she said that Jerry Jeff Walker said, "Oh, do you know about the McGarrigle sisters? These Canadian sisters who sing and play, write songs." And he said, "Oh, I just, was at some folk festival with them, and they sang this great song." And so he sings her, the first few lines of Art Like a Wheel in the back of the cab. And she goes, she said she thought it was the greatest song she'd ever heard. And so she was able, she said, can they get me a tape of that song? And so they sent her a tape of it. And that's how that. Now, this is just a side note. When I was first writing this book, I had interviewed both Chris Darrow, who was a guy who backed Linda Ronstadt for a few years, and also Maria Muldaur, who's an old friend of Linda's. And they both told me a different story about how she heard the song. So I wrote up that story. And then when I gave this book to Linda Ronstadt for her to look at and let me know if I got anything wrong, I was trying to get her to, write like a blurb on the back of the book, which she eventually did. But I said, well, here, read the book. If I'm trying to get you to write a nice blurb on it, you should read it. So, but she got back to me. She said, well, this story is completely wrong about Art Like a Wheel. But the book had already been set in type by the publisher. And I said, well, I need to change this page because the whole opening page of that chapter talked about the song. And they said, well, okay, we'll let you change this page. But the way you have to do it is you have to have the same number of lines, and it has to end the last sentence on the page so that it goes into the next page. That was an interesting, little thing I had to go through, but it worked out. I was glad that, I tried not to have anything in there that wasn't really correct. And I did the same thing with Peter when I was finished with the book. It's the first time I interviewed him, or the second time, I think, once I had thought that I'm going to do this as a book. I said, if I do this, I certainly don't want to get anything wrong. So if I do get a publisher, I'm going to give you the book and you have to tell me if I got something wrong. And he said, fine. So when I was done with the book, I gave it to him and I said, okay, here you go. Tell me if I got something wrong. And he said, well, if accuracy is the goal, we should do this together. So he had me come over to his house, and for 6 hours, we sat there and he just scanned through the book, scaring. He'd stop and he'd go, oh, I'd use a different word here. This isn't quite right. Or no, this story isn't right. Actually, it was more like this. So he'd correct a couple of things as we went through it. But I thought, who else would sit here for 6 hours and go through this book, with the writer, and correct things? I mean, I was amazed. I mean, for 6 hours.
Yeah.
And then he brought in some food. It was time for lunch. We started like 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and then at lunch he brought up a couple of sandwiches and we kept going, and I was impressed,
And Peter made the cover of Rolling Stone in late December 1977. What a thrill that was for him. He told you the story behind this and how he had to get James Taylor and Linda Ronstadt to be part of it. Otherwise, he wasn't going to be on the cover, right?
Yeah, he didn't have to, but they said, well,
if you want to be
we
on,
want to do a story on you, and we're thinking of putting you on the cover, but we will definitely put you on the cover if you have James Taylor and Linda Ronstadt standing next to you, which were at the time, his two big clients. And he told me, he said, usually as a manager, I talk to a client, and if there's an offer, we weigh the pros and the cons. And he said, but in this case, do I want to be on the cover of Rolling Stone? F yes. So he said he kind of like browbeated both Linda and James to be there for Annie Leibovitz to take the picture that ended up on the cover, because that was the first time in Rolling Stone's history. I think Rolling Stone began in like 1967, if I'm not correct.
Yeah, around there. Yeah, I think so.
So this is like 1977, and by now they're now like culturally a big deal. And this was the first time they put a manager / producer, on the cover as like the main story. So that for him, it was a big kind of a feather in the cap for him, showing how far he had come in just 10 years since Peter and Gordon stopped. That now he's, like one of the biggest manager and producer pretty much at the time in Los Angeles.
Yeah, and he knew how to handle artists too, which was not an easy task. But from the people you spoke with, Peter Asher could handle that job. Drummer Rick Marotta and Linda Ronstadt talked about how Peter handled talent. He was a nice guy, but he wasn't afraid to call them out if he felt their egos were getting out of control.
Yeah. He, there are a lot of artists that are, troubled people in one way or another. And, in those days, as the record industry continued to kind of explode and get more and more culturally important, sometimes your ego can get away from you and you start taking drugs, or you're acting like a jerk and treating people bad, or, whatever. With all this money and drugs and fame, it can do something to your head. And Peter was very level-headed and honest with people. And I think Linda Ronstadt was saying that, a lot of people didn't have someone next to them like Peter, who would say, do you know you're acting badly? Do you know that this isn't right? Do you know that, you're this or you're that? I mean, he didn't scream at people. But he would be honest and straightforward with them, and try to, although Linda said, it doesn't mean that, we didn't do inappropriate stuff. We were doing it all the time, but at least we had somebody there that would be honest and straightforward with us, and kind of, not talk down to you, but talk to you like a friend, talk to you like, a brother, and say, this isn't right. You really should, get your act together a little bit here, because you're going off the rails. There's a story in there about how, he was producing someone, and it was like the first, it was just like their big break, to make this album. And Peter was producing it, and things got a little too overwhelming, and they started kind of breaking down and crying, and, with the pressure. And Peter could, just stop everything and take them to another room and sit with them and talk to them, and kind of make sure they understood that, they were good. They were on the right path. I know things are a little crazy right now, but just take your time, get yourself back together, and we'll continue. But you're great. We're getting some good stuff here. Don't worry, you're in good hands. And someone that's sensitive enough to, to treat someone like a human being, which sometimes doesn't happen.
Well, among Peter's many talents is writing wonderfully horrible letters. This is according to his wife, Wendy. What did she have to say about that?
Well, yeah, I talk a little bit about how I guess there was some mix-up. He was doing a record with Diana Ross. He's done a couple of records with Diana Ross. And in the process of making the record, they would stop, at least once a week, and make a cassette at those days, an audio cassette of like rough mixes of where they were. All right, now we've added, the lead guitar, or now we've added some of the vocals, and they would send it on to the record company. And then they were getting ready to do the final step, which was fly to London and do the strings session. And at that point, someone in the higher up picked up one of the cassettes and listened to it. And they listened to like the first one when they had hardly done anything. Basically, they weren't really paying attention to all this work that they were doing and giving them. And now they suddenly went, "Oh, you're not ready to go to London." And they halted the whole thing. And Peter, of course, was very upset that they weren't really following along with all the cassettes that they had been giving them, showing them the progress. And now they had canceled this session they were on their way to London to do. So he wrote them a letter, which basically, just dressed them down massively. But Peter, being the very educated, very smart, and very English person that he is, when you're reading this letter, obviously he's tearing you a new one, but he's doing it in the most polite and intelligent way.
I love that.
He writes these great letters, which are like awful as far as the person who's reading it, but he does it so nicely that Wendy said, that his wife said, that she takes advantage of that sometimes when she wants to tell someone what she really thinks of whatever thing that has just happened, someone doing something wrong, and she'll get Peter to write the letter because he writes such great, awful letters to someone. She'll take advantage of that. And
Yeah.
I think in the book, she said that, Peter said, "Well, wait, have I gone too far here?" It says, no, you haven't gone too far. Keep going.
That's great. Hey, Bonnie Raitt, that's another famous artist that Peter worked with. He's worked with so many, one of the greatest voices in music history. Peter told you he admires her immensely. No surprise there. He ran into her occasionally at parties and gigs, but in 1979, he was brought in to work with Bonnie on her album, The Glow. Peter and Bonnie were determined to get her that breakthrough album she deserved, but it didn't happen. It did good, number 30 spot on the Billboard Pop Albums chart, but listening to the album, it should have gone higher. I think a song like Standing by the Same Old Love is a great track for radio. Sleeps Dark and Silent Gate, another great radio track. You say it was just bad timing?
Yeah, because if you listen to the album, like you said, there's one great track after another, and she's singing great, she's playing great, the musicians, the song choices, but you got to have good promotion behind you, especially in those days. And I think Warner Brothers at the time, the same week that album came out, I think Tusk by Fleetwood Mac, and they were coming off their gigantic success with Rumors. And so I think they were placing all their promotional eggs in the Tusk basket and really didn't push Bonnie all that well. So yeah, it kind of got lost in the shuffle. And sometimes it happens. There's a lot of, I talk in the book about other albums that really didn't get their due that Peter produced. And a lot of it usually has to do with, how the record label treats it when they're putting it out. And I think in this case, that was the case. They just didn't promote it all that well. But it's a great album.
There's a great quote in the book that I have to read. Peter worked with Neil Diamond, and he gave you a great quote. He compared Neil Diamond to Bob Dylan, saying, quote, "They absolutely are in the exact same role in life. I wrote these songs. People like them. I go out and sing them. They have different approaches. Neil is a very serious crowd pleaser, and Dylan is very seriously a crowd confuser. But the essence of what they do, their job, is exactly the same." What a great quote.
Yeah, that's a good one. But yeah, he worked with Neil Diamond on a few albums. I think the first few albums, the projects that they did, he was just producing a handful of songs. But on a number of occasions, they did do an entire album together. And but yeah, he's a big Neil Diamond fan. Certainly, Peter is. And he told me this fun story about they were doing a Christmas album together. The first Christmas album that Neil did. He's done a bunch since then, but the very first one that Peter produced it. And he said that they were listening back. It was a playback to one song, and and Neil said, doesn't this seem strange? And, I may not be quoting it right, but, and Peter said, well, what? And he said, a Jew being produced by an atheist, doing a Christmas song. He said, yes, Neil, it is a little strange. But yeah, he said that Neil has a great sense of humor and he loved working with him. Yeah.
And at 78, about to turn 79 on June 22nd, an early happy birthday to Peter Asher. He has no plans to retire. What's he working on these days?
Yeah, there was a new album that he produced. It just came out a couple of weeks ago for Susanna Hoffs, the lead singer of the Bangles, is what she's known as. I think she's about to be more well known as a best-selling author. She has a book out, and she's writing the screenplay for the movie. I think she's already sold the rights. She's writing the screenplay for it. So she is, a very smart woman, as well as talented and pretty. But he just produced her new album. Like I said, just came out. He is certainly, well, I ended the book by talking about, I was interviewing Peter, and he said, it is that thing where you have to keep reminding people that you're not either dead or deaf.
Yeah.
That he is available for work. And the greatest thing happened just a couple of months ago. Someone contacted me and they said, oh, I read this book, your Peter Asher book. I loved it. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about it. And I wasn't quite sure who this guy was, but it turned out that he is a very somewhat well-known producer and record executive. And he told me that after reading Peter's book and getting to the end of it there where Peter was going, yeah, I'm available for work. And he said, oh, and I realized I had this artist, and I won't name them because the deal has been done. But he said, I'd love to put Peter together with this person and see if I could get them to do an album. And I said, well, great. Yeah, here's Peter's contact info. But, that's one of the things I was hoping would happen with the book, was that people realize how talented this guy is. He still is. And that he does want to keep working. And so, yeah, I was thrilled to be the midwife. Hopefully, if this happens, to go, yeah, here's his info. And they have gotten together and spoken about it. So hopefully it will happen. But the other thing I was hoping to do, I do go into a lot of detail here and there about records that Peter has done. And Peter actually told me, he said, maybe the book would be better if you left out some of these projects that weren't that successful. But some of the stuff that ended up not being successful, I think, are great. And I wanted to, my hope is that people will be reading the book and we'll have, Spotify or YouTube, on nearby, so that when they get to something that they haven't heard before, they'll listen to it. He's rarely, made what you would call a clunker, I can't think of one. Some obviously are more successful than others, but anything that Peter puts his head and his hands to has something to offer you. And hopefully you will listen to them. There are a lot of people that are successful as being a performer, and there are some people that are successful at being record producers, and then there's a few people that are successful at being managers. To have somebody who has been successful at all those things and in such a broad way. He's produced not just rock and pop and country, but Latin and a comedy album. He did a Robin Williams comedy album. He's done all kinds of stuff, and he's done them all incredibly well. So I just wanted to make sure people knew it.
David Jack's book is called Peter Asher, A Life in Music. It is out now through Backbeat Books. Available wherever books are sold. And where can people find you online, David?
Oh, I did put a site together for the book. It's very easy, peterasherbook.com. And there's an extensive discography online as well.
Great. So, I'll put a link to your website in the show notes page. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the podcast, David.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Eric.
That's it. It's in the books.